todos, sean bienvenidos a la tercera y última jornada de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Desafíos para la Seguridad de nuestras ciudades, gestión de territorios para la prevención del delito y la violencia. Mi nombre es Cristóbal Weinborn, soy director del área de ciencias policiales de la Fundación Ciudadana y en nombre de esta quiero agradecerle por su presencia en el tercer y último día de nuestra conferencia, la que sin duda ha tenido un gran éxito con aproximadamente 250 personas conectadas cada día, lo que nos deja una enorme satisfacción de poder llevar estas temáticas a más personas y poder debatir con grandes expertos a nivel mundial, como lo vamos a ver hoy día, sobre temas que sabemos que son de gran importancia para nuestro país. En nuestra jornada del día de hoy, titulada El cambio cultural como centro de las reformas policiales, tendremos destacados expertos en la temática y un interesante panel de conversación. También me gustaría contarles que esta instancia es posible gracias a los esfuerzos de Motorola Solutions Foundation, la Subsecretaría del Interior, la Fiscalía Nacional, Carabineros de Chile y la Policía de Investigaciones junto con la Fundación Ciudadana. Hoy nos acompañarán para dar la bienvenida Ricardo Yáñez, general director de Carabineros de Chile, y Daniel Johnson Rodríguez, director ejecutivo de Fundación Ciudadana. Luego daremos paso a la primera charla magistral de este día, la que será dictada por Lawrence Sherman, director del Centro Jerry Lee de Criminología Experimental de la Universidad de Cambridge y director ejecutivo del Programa para Policías de la misma universidad. Su tema será reformas policiales y la cultura policial rebelde. Posteriormente, tendremos un interesante espacio de conversación donde un panel de expertos liderado por el director ejecutivo de la Fundación, Daniel Johnson, discutirá sobre la reforma policial en Chile. Y para finalizar esta jornada nos acompañará Ed Maguire, profesor de Criminología y Justicia Penal de la Universidad Estatal de Arizona, donde también se desempeña como director del Laboratorio de Innovación de Seguridad Pública, y cuyos temas en realidad serán la actividad policial basada en la evidencia científica, la brutalidad policial y la necesidad de implementar reformas policiales. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por acompañarnos hoy y conectarse por diversos lugares de Chile y el mundo. De hecho, hemos visto personas que se han conectado desde Perú, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Costa Rica, México, Reino Unido, Estados Unidos. Así que aprovecho de recordarles que está habilitada en la plataforma Zoom la función de traducción en 2 idiomas, inglés y español. Por otra parte, durante las charlas magistrales de nuestros invitados, todos quienes nos acompañen podrán participar. Para ello, los y las invitamos a efectuar sus preguntas a través del botón Preguntas y Respuestas presentes en sus pantallas. También pueden compartir sus impresiones por sus redes sociales usando el hashtag #ConferenciaFPC. Sean todos y todas muy bienvenidos y damos por iniciada la tercera jornada de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional Desafíos para la Seguridad de nuestras ciudades, gestión de territorios para la prevención del delito y la violencia, con las palabras del director ejecutivo de Fundación Ciudadana, Daniel Johnson Rodríguez. Bienvenido, Daniel.
Muchas gracias, Cristóbal. Bueno, muy buenos días a todos y muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este tercer día de la 12ª Conferencia Internacional de Fundación Ciudadana. Como decía Cristóbal, se llama Desafíos de la Seguridad en nuestras ciudades, gestión de los territorios para la prevención de los delitos y la violencia, que organizamos con Motorola Solutions Foundation y que cuenta con el patrocinio del Ministerio del Interior y Seguridad Pública, la Fiscalía Nacional, Carabineros de Chile y la Policía de Investigaciones de Chile. Como ya les adelantaba Cristóbal, hoy abordaremos el tema del cambio cultural como centro de las reformas policiales, temática relevante, contingente y de la cual, si bien se ha hablado, pensamos que aún es necesario aunar el entendimiento de su fin y de las acciones a emprender para alcanzarlo. La última encuesta que realizamos en Paz Ciudadana mostró que solo el 17% de los entrevistados sabe que existe un proceso de reforma de Carabineros y que este está en curso, lo que nos debe invitar a redoblar esfuerzos para su comunicación, tanto al interior de la institución como a la ciudadanía, especialmente considerando que es un proceso que tomará varios años y que debe mantener el impulso que logre materializar los resultados esperados. ¿Hacia dónde debe evolucionar la función policial? ¿Cuáles son sus objetivos? ¿Y cuál es la forma de cumplirla? ¿Qué competencias debe tener cada efectivo policial? ¿Y cuál es el camino que debemos recorrer para lograrla? ¿Cómo debe relacionarse la institución con el gobierno? ¿Y cómo debe relacionarse también con la ciudadanía? Son temas que abordaremos hoy y que esperamos nos permitan iluminar un proceso que consideramos necesario y que requiere profundos consensos técnicos y políticos para poder materializarse. Para realizar este análisis, como ya nos contó Cristóbal, hemos invitado y nos acompañarán expositores del mayor nivel internacional y también a los actores locales que son los protagonistas y que son fundamentales, por supuesto, en llevar adelante este proceso. Espero que este tercer día de conferencia sea un aporte al entendimiento y conocimiento de este proceso, y sin más preámbulos, porque estamos todos ansiosos ya por escuchar las palabras del profesor Sherman, los invito a atender y participar en las conferencias y todas las actividades que tenemos preparadas para ustedes en el día de hoy. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. A continuación tengo el agrado de presentarles al general director de Carabineros de Chile, Ricardo Yáñez. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí el día de hoy, ya que es de suma importancia para nosotros como Fundación y para las personas que nos están acompañando en este seminario, tener la visión desde Carabineros de lo que se entiende por reforma policial, que es nuestra temática de esta jornada. Así que bienvenido, general. Suyo al... Bueno.
Muchas gracias, muy buenos días. Junto con saludarle y agradecer la invitación que me hiciera para Fundación Ciudadana para participar en la apertura de esta tercera jornada de trabajo en la conferencia internacional destinada a reflexionar respecto del cambio cultural como centro de las reformas policiales. En estos breves minutos que tengo para interactuar con ustedes, me gustaría en tres esfuerzos. El primero, vinculados a comentarles algunas cuestiones de contexto, como por ejemplo, a quién represento y el rol que cumple Carabineros de Chile en mi país, lo cual no me tomará más de 2 o 3 minutos. El segundo, en reconocer los problemas institucionales para generar los cambios culturales, desde la experiencia en inclusión de 94 años y el caminar hacia nuestro primer centenario, lo cual no me tomará más de 5 minutos. Y finalmente, lo tercero, en realzar la importancia de cultivar la capacidad adaptativa frente a las nuevas necesidades de seguridad ciudadana, lo cual me tomará alrededor de 2 minutos. Pues bien, definido entonces, vamos por lo primero. En la cuestión de contexto, Carabineros de Chile es una institución del Estado que conforma la fuerza pública y existe para dar eficacia al derecho, rol consagrado en nuestra Constitución. Está integrada por alrededor de 60.000 hombres y mujeres que se despliegan a lo largo de todo el territorio nacional en cerca de 1.000 cuarteles operativos. Es decir, el monopolio de uso de la fuerza legítima del Estado en materia de orden y seguridad interior en Chile le corresponde a nuestra institución. La visión sistémica en torno a la función que desarrollamos da cuenta de roles tales como la seguridad pública, el orden público, la seguridad fronteras, seguridad privada, seguridad vial, que es el tránsito, emergencias y catástrofes, registrándose anualmente cerca de 17,7 millones de procedimientos policiales, que se traducen en cerca de 33 procedimientos por minuto, 33 interacciones que tienen nuestros efectivos con la comunidad, flujos de 600.000 personas detenidas, 150.000 los más gravosos, ¿cierto? Por homicidio, robo, lesiones, hurto, violencia doméstica y drogas. Además, informamos a los municipios la participación en rutinas delictuales de alrededor de 80.000 niños, niñas y adolescentes menores de 18 años anualmente a través del programa institucional 24 horas, con el propósito de propiciar intervenciones tempranas multisistémicas de prevención social. Nuestros procesos formativos oficiales tienen una duración de 8 semestres académicos, complementados con 4 semestres para asumir mando directivo, y los suboficiales de 4 semestres académicos, complementando con 3 semestres para asumir el mando directivo. Y diferentes procesos de capacitación y perfeccionamiento continuo para el desarrollo de nuestra carrera. Además, existen procesos académicos alternativos para los suboficiales que permiten a través del mérito académico optar a la carrera de oficial. Más de 2.500 agentes de policías amigas se han formado en nuestras escuelas y participan activamente en nuestros procesos de especialización y perfeccionamiento. Finalmente, había que agregar que desde la década de los 90, Carabineros de Chile proyectó el desarrollo de sus procesos operativos y administrativos a través de la formulación estratégica, prospectiva, en planes quinquenales que orientaron a la visión de futuro a la cual aspira la institución con miras al Carabinero del Centenario. Hoy, materializada a través del Plan Estratégico de Desarrollo Policial 2021-2028, en una unión, ¿cierto?, con la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Como resultado de lo anterior, se implementó la estrategia de operaciones urbanas Plan Cuadrante de Seguridad Preventiva, integrando modelos de policiamiento unitario, de resolución de problemas basados en la inteligencia policial y en la evidencia, lo cual redituó altos niveles de confianza que se evitaron fuertemente a partir del año 2017 por las razones que dividiré en el segundo tema a tratar. Reconocer los problemas institucionales para crear los cambios culturales. ¿Por qué nuestra confianza decayó? Porque nos equivocamos en varias cosas. Fuimos autorreferentes, nos alejamos de la comunidad, y para esto existen muchas variables que no las voy a mencionar ahora, pero que han impactado directamente en el desarrollo operativo de nuestros carabineros en el plan cuadrante de seguridad preventiva. Y tuvimos que enfrentar una serie de episodios vergonzosos que nos dañaron profundamente nuestra alma, pese a que involucran menos del 1% de la dotación institucional. El fraude, falta de controles internos y externos, involucró principalmente a carabineros especialistas en la área financiera. La operación Huracán, la creación de pruebas falsas para ejecutar una responsabilidad penal, involucró un equipo especializado institucional. El caso Cambrigde, mentiras en un procedimiento policial que resultó una persona fallecida producto de uso de armas por parte de un equipo de intervención. Como denominador común, estos tres hechos constituyeron actos de corrupción, entendida aquella como el abandono de un deber posicional, público en nuestro caso, en pos de un interés particular y que se ocultó aparentando la regla de la ley. El resultado fue un daño profundo a la imagen de Carabineros de Chile. A ello se sumarían una serie de acusaciones por los efectos o consecuencias en las personas del uso de la fuerza legítima como responsables del orden público en los graves hechos de violencia y destrucción que se generaron a partir del 18 de octubre del año 2019, durante 165 días de manifestaciones y actos de violencia sostenida a nivel nacional y que derivaron en 19.000 eventos delictuales, 29.000 personas detenidas, 4.817 carabineros lesionados de diversa consideración, con impacto balístico, fracturados, quemados, con TEC, con pérdida ocular. 52 cuarteles fueron atacados en 544 oportunidades. 738 vehículos policiales fueron dañados en casi 1.200 ataques. Carabineros desarrolló 1.400 procesos administrativos, eliminó 40 funcionarios y sancionó a 854. Paralelamente, el Ministerio Público formalizó 83 carabineros y se presentaron 162 recursos de amparo y 660 recursos de protección, de los cuales cerca del 90% fueron rechazados por los tribunales de alzada. ¿Cuáles fueron los problemas esta vez? No estábamos preparados para enfrentar un escenario como el que vivimos. El 3% de nuestra dotación operativa integraba las fuerzas especiales dedicadas al control del orden público. De un día para otro, el personal que efectuaba labores voluntarias de seguridad pública al alero de la metodología de policiamiento antiterrorista pasaron a cumplir roles y función de control del orden público. No obstante lo anterior, Carabineros, teniendo en cuenta la regulación constitucional y legal, complementó sus actuaciones a través de la regulación de normativa por elementos de soft law, protocolos, de tal forma que llevaran a una probabilidad mínima las consecuencias del uso de armas menos letales. Y posteriormente, iniciar procesos de capacitación a los carabineros que en general no contaban con refuerzos transversales en materia de control del público y derechos humanos. A la fecha, casi el 90% de nuestra dotación ha sido capacitada en estas materias. No obstante a ello, y pese a que nuevamente el contexto del PBT social propició cuestionamientos al desempeño profesional de la institución, generamos alianzas estratégicas con universidades, centros de estudios y la comunidad civil, permitiendo iniciar un proceso de reforma y modernización, del cual les comentaré en la tercera parte de mi reflexión, sin antes precisar que las actuales mediciones de confianza dan cuenta de lo siguiente. La encuesta del Centro de Estudios Públicos en agosto de 2021, la comunidad confía más en Carabineros de Chile que en la Convención Constitucional, que en la televisión, que en los tribunales de justicia, que en el Ministerio Público, que en el gobierno, que en el Congreso y los partidos políticos, indicados en orden de confianza decreciente. El índice de paz ciudadana en octubre del 2021, la comunidad confía más en Carabineros de Chile que en el Ministerio Público, que en el Poder Judicial, que en el gobierno y el Congreso, indicados en orden de confianza decreciente. Indico lo anterior porque una cosa es comprender que la policía que los cambios y la reforma de la policía son absolutamente necesarios, y la otra distinta es asegurar que aquellas vayan de la mano con la modernización y reforma de todas las estructuras sociales del Estado, especialmente aquellos que conforman el subsistema de seguridad pública. A modo de ejemplo, y para reforzar este punto, resulta necesario advertir que el principal problema, desde lo teórico, es omitir declarar con fuerza que la dimensión social no es función directa del policiamiento. De hecho, la violencia y el delito es el efecto observable de la dimensión social. La policía actúa sobre los efectos de la dimensión y no sobre sus causas, la cual se cultiva el origen, el proceso de aprendizaje virtual, largamente tratado por la sociología, asociación diferencial, y que tiene como principal fundamento estructural, funcionalista, la nómina, en términos de Durkheim y Merton, que en términos simples podríamos indicar como la adaptación intelectual del sujeto para resolver la tensión entre los fines y los medios para alcanzarlos. Lo anterior es independiente, como dije, a impulsar corrientes de perfeccionamiento continuo con la policía, buenas prácticas, etc., para elevar los estándares preventivos situacionales y la eficacia del control policial y la satisfacción de las personas, por cierto. 3. Importancia de cultivar la capacidad adaptativa frente a las nuevas necesidades de seguridad ciudadana. Si concluyendo la reflexión final en torno a la necesidad de cultivar la capacidad adaptativa, habría que comenzar por un acto de humildad, de reconocernos como fuerza pública al servicio de la comunidad y tal como lo definió en 1789, la Declaración de Derechos del Hombre y Ciudadano en Francia, afirmar que, artículo 12, la garantía de los derechos del hombre y del ciudadano necesitan de una fuerza pública. Por ello, esta fuerza es instituida en beneficio de todos, y no para el provecho particular de aquellos a quienes se encomienda. Es decir, comprendiendo que existimos para la defensa de los derechos del hombre y del ciudadano, la capacidad adaptativa que debe llevarnos a la reflexión permanente en torno a cómo podemos conciliar el deber formal de hacer cumplir la ley con el respeto al derecho consustancial del individuo en un proceso de discernimiento ético que por sí es complejo. En concreto, en el marco de la capacidad adaptativa propia de las relaciones vivas, aquellas que aprenden de sí mismas, Carabineros inició un proceso de modernización y reforma el año 2018, el cual al cabo de 3 años ha permitido modificar estructuras e iniciar una transformación cultural desde las aulas de clase que esperamos tenga frutos en el mediano y largo plazo. En dicho proceso incorporamos las mejores experiencias internacionales, reconociendo que muchos países han vivido experiencias similares: Estados Unidos, Alemania, Francia, España, Inglaterra, entre otros. Al alero de los fenómenos propios de los escritos en los 80 por el sociólogo alemán Ulrich Beck, como Sociedad del Riesgo, donde el vacío político genera que las iniciativas ciudadanas y los movimientos sociales adquieren el sentido de identidad que antes tenían los partidos políticos, sindicatos o parlamentos. Sin lugar a dudas, el trabajo multiagenciado que integra la comunidad civil es un elemento fundamental para acompañarnos en el cambio cultural al cual aspiramos dar a conocer nuestro proceso de modernización y reforma. En definitiva, somos una gran suma de voluntades al servicio de nuestros compatriotas. Muchas gracias por su atención, un fuerte abrazo y una gran jornada.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, general director, por su valiosa exposición en esta conferencia. Sin duda su mirada y el análisis de los procesos vividos por Carabineros son fundamentales y sin duda son la base de la reforma que está en curso y que también describía. Aprovecho también esta oportunidad para agradecer la colaboración y todas las múltiples oportunidades que nos han dado para trabajar en conjunto entre Carabineros y Fundación Ciudadana, y que esperamos también poder seguir colaborando y poder aportar para alcanzar a ese Carabineros del centenario, como lo han definido, que sin duda es una visión que nosotros consideramos apropiada y en la cual desde ya nos ponemos a disposición para poder colaborar. Así que infinitas gracias, general, sin duda, una posición muy valiosa y una muy buena apertura para este tercer día de conferencia que estamos iniciando.
Muchas gracias, Daniel, muchas gracias, general. Ahora es momento de nuestra primera charla magistral de esta jornada, a cargo del profesor Lawrence Sherman, académico destacadísimo y fundador de lo que hoy conocemos como actividad policial basada en la evidencia científica. El profesor Sherman es el director del Centro de Cambridge para la actividad policial basada en la evidencia científica y profesor emérito Wolfson de Criminología de la Universidad de Cambridge. También es el director del Centro Jerry Lee para la Criminología Experimental y del Programa Ejecutivo para Policías en la misma universidad. Y hoy nos expondrá sobre los procesos de reformas policiales y la cultura policial rebelde. Para mí es un honor presentar al profesor Sherman, quizá, quien además de su extenso currículum académico de influencia mundial en lo que hoy conocemos como actividad policial basada en la evidencia, fue mi supervisor de tesis doctoral en la Universidad de Cambridge, donde tuve el privilegio de poder trabajar en numerosos proyectos con él y aprender de primera fuente sobre la importancia de utilizar el lenguaje de la ciencia en el trabajo de las policías. Esta charla será en inglés, por lo que quienes lo necesiten, tenemos la opción de traducción simultánea en Zoom, como les mencionaba anteriormente. Muy bienvenido, profesor Sherman, y gracias por estar hoy día con nosotros.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weinborn. And let me just share my slides, if I may, to show you some things about the, let's see, I have to find the right button, which is always obscured. I need to start the slideshow. So, there it is. Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to talk about what Dr. Weinborn mentioned in the key concept of science, because any effort to undertake police reform needs to be very clear, as Daniel Johnson said, about what is the objective. And I don't mean just the objective of the reform, I mean the fundamental question of what is the purpose of police? What does a society want from its police force? I would suggest to you that the way societies relate to their police is very much like a marriage of long standing, of many years, centuries, a marriage with some history that many might regret on both sides, a marriage that has children and grandchildren and many people depending on the success of this marriage. And I can say that many marriages that are challenged have a variety of outcomes. I say this myself as a divorced man with very good relationships with my first wife and our children and grandchildren, as well as with my second wife and her children and grandchildren. So there are many pathways to resolving the kinds of anger or disagreements that may exist in a marriage, and many pathways to finding the better relationship between police and the public that so many countries and democracies in particular are seeking at present. I think the key is that the idea of what the options are in a police context must be realistic. The idea suggested in the United States by the author of a book called The End of Policing makes an argument that we don't need police. And that argument, to the extent it influenced the police and the public, has, I think, helped to cause the largest increase in homicide in the United States in recent history. Having the police stop policing is crazy. We know this from police strikes. We know this from the backing off of police in confronting violent gangs in the city where my daughter lives with two of my grandchildren, Minneapolis, which has had a 100% increase in gunshot crimes, as many other cities have, New York, for example. And the option of not having a police force in favor of having mental health workers, social workers, others who do not have the power to use force to protect people is simply off the list of options. just like in a way, we can say that for people to live alone is a pretty serious choice in societies where many people may be dying of loneliness. We need to do what Rodney King once said after his terrible abuse by the Los Angeles police in 1991, which led to riots and further riots after the police were acquitted of the charges. Rodney King, the victim of police crimes, said, "Can't we all just get along?" And that's where I think we have to begin the conversation. Not at number one, which is a crazy idea, but at number two, about building different institutions, either by keeping the ones we have, or if we're going to build something completely different, such as the New Mexico program of triage phone calls saying this is a mental health issue, don't send the police, send the mental health crisis team. But that needs to be built in addition to the institutions you currently have. Otherwise, you risk trying to rebuild a plane while the passengers are still flying, and everybody is at risk from not maintaining the institutions you have while you're trying to build new ones. And there's a further case to be made that no matter what new institutions you create, you can keep the institutions you have for a very long time, if only for continuity. When I first wrote about this in 2002, I talked about parallel institutions that would allow every serving police officer to continue to work in the institution that they know and often love, for one very good reason, which is that having a sudden firing, dismissal of all of the police in your community is an extremely dangerous thing to even contemplate. When Adolf Hitler arrested the entire Copenhagen police force in September of 1944, and 2,000 officers were taken away to Germany, with hundreds of them dying in concentration camps, along with specified ethnic groups and gypsies. The impact on Copenhagen, even with the German army still in charge, was a huge increase in crime. And had Hitler not taken the police away, we can only imagine what sort of chaos would have further ensued. I think what I'm arguing for, based on historical evidence, based on the recent history of police institutions since the Renaissance, and especially the Enlightenment of the 18th century, what we need to do now for police reform is to engage in reconstruction, the way that many marriages have successfully been rebuilt, with a philosophy of we can work it out, and to strengthen the institution itself by better understanding, better will to make it work, and also a way to make it work. In English, we have a cliche about where there is a will, then there is a way. If you want to do something, you can find how it can be done. But that's why it's such an important question. If major police reform requires public will, and if Chile has that will right now, the first thing it must recognize is that that is not enough. It is necessary, but not sufficient. You also must pay very close attention to the way in which you propose to reform policing. And by paying close attention, I think we must recognize the level of detail that is implicit in every engineering effort for building a bridge or a building that won't fall down. That detail is informed by science. And by science, I don't mean test tubes and fingerprints. I mean the logic of science, the testing of hypotheses and observing whether or not they are falsified, whether our good ideas actually work in practice under controlled testing or not. That is the main question of experimental criminology, which is the basis for evidence-based policing. A subject of a journal that we have published since 2017, and which we define as something that police and societies can use to make decisions that can get better results than decisions made without good evidence. So what do I mean by results? I mean, first and foremost, less harm. Daniel Johnson asked what should be the objective of the police. And if in the English tradition, we go back to the founding of the Metropolitan Police of London in 1829, this was a decision made on the basis of a very deep intellectual body of knowledge about deterrence, going back to the writings of Cesare Beccaria in the 1760s and enhanced by Jeremy Bentham, who founded University College London, around rational choice and indeed modern economics as we know it. But the fundamental asset of that body of thinking was the idea of utility. Hence, they were called the utilitarians. That's what economics tries to deal with. How do you get the most utility or good things? I'm afraid that in policing, we have rather the flip side job of how to minimize the bad things, how to have as little harm as possible. And if we understand that, we see policing as the prevention of harm rather than the hunting for bad guys. Now, it's true that one way to prevent harm is to lock up very dangerous people. In the case of Anders Breivik, who killed over 70 young people in Norway, and who is scheduled to have a parole hearing in about 10 years now. That's a policy decision for the Norwegians, and the police have nothing to do with it. I would personally prefer, if I were a Norwegian, that Anders Breivik should never, ever be allowed out of his cell, because he's just killed too many people to be given that right. But that is a personal, moral judgment. What we can agree on is not whether he should be in prison, but how many people he killed. And if we assign the value of one life sentence for each person he killed, then we are maybe talking about 60 years of his adult life times 75 people. And that is a quantifiable measure of how much harm Anders Breivik committed 10 years ago this August on that island in Norway and blowing up the Justice Ministry building in central Oslo, where he blinded somebody who had been at my wedding. And we're still suffering the harm from what he's done, which is not just powerful, but measurable. And the harm that we want police to address is of two kinds. First, of course, we want police protecting citizens from each other. But second, and with a renewed commitment and transparency in the UK, in the US, and probably in every democracy on earth, we want to be better at police protecting citizens from unlawful policing, from using the powers that police uniquely have to kidnap, rape, murder, and do horrible crimes by abusing the trust expressed in them by the police institutions that employ them. The tradition of loyalty within policing is very commendable in some circumstances, very helpful in others, but it cannot take precedence over protecting citizens from unlawful actions of police officers. We have to accept that everybody commits crimes, children, grown-ups, very old people, citizens who are not police, and citizens who are police. And if we take the reduction of harm as our primary purpose, it is just as important, if not more so, to predict which police officers are going to harm other people and to at least remove them from the employment that gives them extra opportunities to do so. The so-called rogue cops, who in many cases have had repeated incidents in which the facts aren't disputed, but in which the punishment was not sufficient to stop them serving as police officers, such as Derek Chauvin with his 18 complaints and 3 shootings of citizens prior to his killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. The mission of police in a democracy, I would submit, is consistent with harm reduction because of the role of peacekeeping, which since 1361 in England gave the police the power not to enforce the law, with the understanding in that era that enforcement for its own sake can cause civil war, mayhem, riots, burning of police stations, burning of people's homes. They didn't have police stations in 1361. They didn't even have a formal police organization, but they had magistrates, justices of the peace, who were responsible to be both police, prosecutor, and judges for their local communities. And to protect the rule of law, the lawgivers of the day wanted to ensure that the law was useful for prosperity, for helping people live their lives, raise their crops, feed their children, and pray to their God without being harmed by the bad judgments of law enforcement for the sake of law enforcement. One of the biggest differences between US police and British police is that US officials, including Barack Obama, refer to the police institution as law enforcement. Nobody says that in the United Kingdom. What we talk about in the United Kingdom is the role of the police in keeping the peace. And that means preventing harm and minimizing harm by the police in order to prevent harm by citizens, in the same way that the Greek doctor Hippocrates famously was said to have created a motto for medicine, which was first do no harm. Historians now think he never said it, but it doesn't matter who said it. What it really means is don't cause more harm than the harm you're trying to prevent. And 1,000 times a year, that question arises in the United States when the police shoot people to death. What we're all looking for, I think, is a way to untie a Gordian knot, this conglomeration of the police are here to bring bad people to justice and get them punished. No, the police are here to prevent them doing harm in the first place. And several other goals for the police that get caught up in that knot. I think we can cut the Gordian knot by agreeing that the one thing we can ask the police to do is to minimize the harm in society, whether it's caused by citizens or police themselves. How we do that is certainly very complex. It can have many knock-on effects and many long-term consequences. But trying to master all of the things the police do, the 30,000 officers of the Carabineros, the 1,000 police stations across Chile, the hundreds of crime categories, the tens of thousands of requests for police service every hour, the wide variety of activities the police are undertaking, largely because they are responding to what they hear from the public. I want this, I want that, I need help, please come help me. And that has evolved with digital communications to the point where modern police organizations, no matter how digital their capability, they're being torn apart by all of these conflicting aims and objectives. The kinds of decisions that can help to focus policing on reducing harm begin with targeting the time of the police much more selectively and limiting what they will do if somebody calls the police and increasing what the police do based on their intelligence on how to prevent harm and seeing their job as, say, football players, as not just defending the goal, but actually trying to score goals at the other end of the field, pushing forward proactively against the threats of harm and suffering in the population. And when they do that, like any good football coach, they should be testing what combinations of people, what plays with the ball will work, and what options don't work, and not using the options that don't work, but concentrating on the ones that do. That is the second T of testing, with the premise that you are tracking at the same time. You can't tell what works unless you know whether it's getting done. And the tracking of police actions, where they work, what they do, what times of day they do it, this is still in its infancy, not because we don't know how to do it, but because we haven't been able to persuade the officers and managers who must do it that it is important, that it is fundamental. Just like we can't persuade doctors to wash their hands when they go from one patient who they've touched to another patient who they've touched. And because doctors won't allow themselves to be tracked in the United States, the estimate is over 200,000 people per year die of infections caused by doctors who won't wash their hands. Now, we have tested washing the hands as early as the 1840s in Vienna. And Mr. Semmelweis, Dr. Semmelweis, who tested hand washing and found massive prevention of deaths of newborn mothers. For that, he was rewarded by losing his medical license and being told to leave Vienna because we don't want to hear bad news. And that, of course, is often the fate of testing. President Trump said, please stop testing people for COVID, you'll just find more cases. Well, perhaps if we had done more testing and done more prevention and targeted the resources more effectively, then you wouldn't have so many dead people in the United States, or indeed so many other parts of the world. The decisions of targeting, testing, and tracking are applied science. They use evidence about where is the greatest harm, what under testing, what is the most effective way to deal with that harm, and under tracking, are we seeing these policies carried out? It's one thing to say we have policies and practices. It's another thing to know whether this week we had 87% implementation of policies, and last week we had 53%, so that we're getting better or worse. But tracking on a weekly basis, much as somebody who's on a diet watches the calories that they eat, or somebody who's trying to reduce their alcohol intake will actually start counting their drinks. Or if you have an iPhone that has a step counter, you can see if you're doing 10,000 steps a day. Tracking is a feature of the digital world. It should not come to policing last. The importance of tracking what police do to prevent harm means that it is urgent to introduce tracking as a part of not just the culture of policing, but the system of policing, the everyday business as usual of policing that pays attention to all three T's as the way to accomplish the will to reduce the harm, to do what people from all these other countries listed here have been doing after the last 25 years of studying these ideas and doing projects based on the three T's for their master's theses when they come to Cambridge to study. And since pandemic starts in March 2020, we have been providing the same material in short courses, online courses, not only for analysts, but also for frontline field leaders. And while we don't have a course in Spanish yet, we certainly would be happy to develop one so that everybody in the second largest language group in the world, which is Spanish, can understand these ideas in their own language. And the police who are already practicing evidence-based policing are predominantly English language speakers. But it is an impressive network of professionals, from constables on the beat to chiefs and directors general of police. There's over 5,000 who belong to societies of evidence-based policing, and over 1,000 Cambridge master's degree graduates are often leading with them and talking about what evidence-based policing is and how you can master the knowledge. So again, it's a method of making decisions. And the most important decisions that are made are setting priorities for police time, choosing policies that they should follow, and ensuring that those policies are delivered, which is to say, tracking, testing, targeting, these three T's coming together to get exactly the right policing in exactly the right place with the right people at the right time, based on empirical research. Aiming selectively, not just patrolling all over a city, but concentrating patrols where the crimes are most likely to occur. Every study we do in England shows that there's still spending time where there's no crime and spending very little time where there's lots of crime. And just in July, the policing minister of the UK said targeted policing in hotspots is the best evidence for a policy that is widely disregarded. The most disregarded, highly evidence-based policy we have. And I would argue that's because of tracking, which has been insufficient and which has not been made part of police supervisory systems. Not because of testing. There's over 68 internationally conducted randomized experiments, clinical trials, like we use to test COVID in our vaccinations. Those trials consistently show that, as you would expect, if the police spend more time in these high crime locations, less crime occurs. And with the failure to do so, we have fury at the police, especially when vulnerable people, like young women, are snatched off the streets and murdered in a relatively safe society. So with this big picture putting harm at the center of what police do, we must recognize how important the prevention of harm is to the building of police legitimacy and to the management of police demand. And increasingly, we're looking at telling people, no, they cannot have a police car because a bicycle was taken from their unlocked garage while they were away for 2 weeks on vacation. You can report that online. You can maybe even talk on the telephone to a police officer, but we're not going to tie up officers to drive some distance to your house just to look at you face to face. Zoom has put an end to seeing face-to-face interaction as necessary and affordable, because it's destroying the planet with carbon to put all these people together face-to-face when it can be done very cheaply by telephone or even video screens. And our experiments are showing that people prefer, in England, they prefer to have a quick, immediate response by telephone or video call rather than waiting for the police to come in a car. But that's only one of many ways that demand can be resolved in order to spare more time, to free more time for the prevention of harm through innovation and evaluation and transparency in targeting, testing, and tracking. Because starting with targeting, as Steve Jobs said about building the Apple Computer Company, you have to decide what not to do, as well as deciding what to do. And much of what police do right now is a waste of time relative to other things they could be doing based on good research evidence that would be much more effective in preventing crime. You can't put everything on your to-do list. You can't even clear up a backlog of cases from the COVID epidemic without having a plan. And what Britain and other places are currently doing is planning not to have a plan. And they'll just, in effect, throw all the files up in the air and take the first one that comes along. Are we going with the oldest cases, the newest cases, the highest harm cases? What's our priority? Our priority, I think, begins with harm, because all crimes are not created equal, not in their harm, not in their sentencing, not in causing public outrage. We just had this young woman murdered in London, and the public are furious, talking about the broken policing system in England because they failed to prevent this abduction and murder, by the way, committed by a police officer, a rogue police officer, who had a history of minor accusations that nobody looked at through the patterns of artificial intelligence, through the analysis of big data. And we still have yet to be serious about big data policing of thousands of police officers. And any force with 30,000 constables, like the Metropolitan Police of London, or perhaps a police force in Chile, has the potential to use prediction to achieve prevention, not just justice after a horrible crime occurs, but resource allocations to maximize prevention. And for the public, that means to identify offenders, victims, and places where high harm is most likely to occur. And for police, it is to identify not just individual officers, but networks of officers who are jointly subject to complaints. And that kind of analysis can lead to reassignments of officers, closely monitoring them. They don't have to lose their jobs. They don't have to be convicted of a crime. They can be managed in a way that reduces the risk of a police officer seriously damaging the life of a citizen and the reputation of the police. Now, all of that's built into our Cambridge Crime Harm Index, which is published in 2016 at this website. You can get the slides from the Fundación. How does it work? You take each crime type. You identify the days of imprisonment for each crime type. You multiply the total numbers of crimes of each type by the days of imprisonment, the weight for that type of crime. And at the bottom, you sum up all of the days in prison recommended across all of the reported crimes, and not just those convicted, but everything that's reported, whether or not there's a conviction. Because what we're trying to measure is the harm to victims in society. So we must leave out crimes the police discover through proactive detection, traffic offenses, or drug enforcement. We have to focus on victims or witnesses telling the police that they've been hurt. And using that information, we have now, in the paper recently produced by Cristobal Weinborn and his colleagues, a Chilean crime harm index. So you not only have the will, you have the way to get to this. And I think I should stop right now, because that's my way to comply with my time requirements.
Muchas gracias, profesor, por esta interesante y contingente reflexión sobre el rol de la policía en la comunidad y el cambio de paradigma desde la detención hacia la prevención basada en el daño en delito. Hemos recibido bastantes preguntas en el chat y estoy tratando de organizarlas de alguna manera. Coincidentemente, la primera pregunta era respecto de cómo uno puede calcular, o cuál sería...
Se silenció, Cristóbal, tu micrófono.
Cristobal, you're on mute. Can you take yourself off mute? Off mute? Yeah, okay. You can't hear, sorry. The translator can't hear you. Okay. Yes.
Denos un minuto, estamos tratando de corregirlo. Al parecer tenemos un problema central. Vamos a corregirlo en un minuto.
Good. Okay. Could I just show these few slides while he's doing that? If I do a share screen and show you where we are. This is the distribution of harm from the highest harm offenders who have, this is the victim concentration. In one police force in England, less than 4% of the victims experienced 85% of all of the harm, thereby leading that police force to reorganize the way they dealt with victims, not based on each offense being equal, but on concentrating on the harm. This is a setup in another police force where every offender who comes in has their risk assessed by their quantitative analysis of their previous history to see if they're very likely to commit a high harm crime. And if so, different actions are taken, but also to identify those who are very unlikely and to let them go. So the high risk in Philadelphia, the 2% had the vast majority of the murders, and the low risk people had virtually no crime at all. And this difference in the harm levels coming out of the high 2%, showing the vast majority of the harm of the entire pyramid of offenders, is a good way to think about it. So is the hotspots in Tokyo, where we're looking at the amount of crime, violent crime, and most of Tokyo had no violent crime, but the police refused to put more police where the volcanoes of hot spots for violence are located. This is Cristobal Weinborn's work in Birmingham, England, where he compares just counting crime equally to multiplying it by harm. And that calculation on the right actually covers less land, so it's more efficient for police. And finally, in Denmark, when they thought the crime count was going down, as it was, they didn't know that the crime harm was going up, as in this example in England. And the Prime Minister of India now has asked us to trace the harm level, which looks like this, compared to the count level, which looks like that, so that you're seeing a very different trend depending on whether it's crime, harm, or counts. So I'll stop right there and see if we can now hear from Cristobal Weinborn.
Estamos todavía tratando de resolver el problema de Cristóbal, pero mientras me voy a tomar yo la atribución de hacer algunas preguntas. Para nosotros quedamos muy sorprendidos cuando Cristóbal nos contó el Harm Index, y ahí aprovechamos de leer su paper, profesor, y todo lo que se ha publicado sobre la herramienta. Parece una herramienta brillante y principalmente por la importancia que tiene para poder priorizar la acción policial, pero fundamentalmente por la simpleza que tiene para su cálculo. Normalmente tratar de entender cuáles son el mayor daño que hace un delito con respecto de otro, cuántos hurtos corresponden a un homicidio, es una discusión que puede no tener nunca un fin. Lo medimos en función de los recursos que pudiera generar el daño económico que produce el Estado. Es muy difícil ponerse de acuerdo. Sin embargo, esto determina, mira, los países ya se pusieron de acuerdo, estamos condenando en función de esto, ocupémoslo para priorizar la acción policial, y nos pareció brillante, así que nosotros en Chile somos unos promotores de su trabajo, profesor. Con Cristóbal hemos tratado de hacer esfuerzos importantes para que esto se empiece a usar, y de hecho estamos partiendo un trabajo, un estudio que bueno, lo estamos haciendo también con Barak Ariel, con el profesor Ariel de la Universidad de Cambridge, de medir el impacto del patrullaje hecho priorizadamente en áreas donde se concentra el daño del delito. Así que esperamos tenerle noticias sobre ese estudio, que estamos muy contentos de poder realizar. Sobre preguntas, tengo una pregunta que nos hacen, que es que también estando muy de acuerdo con la necesidad de hacer este cambio de mentalidad, y también tiene que ver evidentemente con entender cuál es el fin de las policías, pero ¿cómo lograr ese proceso del cambio de mentalidad desde atrapar a un delincuente, que además es muy tentador porque uno tiene un dato que mostrar? El atrapar a un delincuente, uno tiene una persona que cometió un delito y que yo la puedo mostrar que la detuve, y lo puedo medir de una manera muy simple, a cambiarlo hacia una mentalidad de proteger a las personas del daño del delito, cuando no tengo ese no delito que mostrar caso a caso. ¿Cómo se logra en las policías? ¿Cómo uno puede construir este proceso y cuánto tarda?
My recommendation is to accept the value that is placed on catching criminals, but to retarget it, to put it at the highest levels of harm, to use investigative techniques under the rule of law, such as covert surveillance or even decoy policing, where you have somebody who either has a prior record or you have intelligence that this is a very dangerous person, and put the resources into getting those people into long prison terms, with preferably better prisons, but still off the streets, and having the high volume cases get the priority they deserve if they are very low in harm. So if you recover somebody's stolen computer, that's nice. It's not a waste of time. But if you could prevent a rape murder by spending the same amount of time on catching that person before they do another such crime, I would argue the legitimacy of the police will be greater because they're protecting the people from the really, really serious threats that they face, and not what in effect is it's a minor annoyance for us to lose our computer. For me, it would be a disaster, but nobody would die and I could be starting my life again. And you can't do that if your daughter's been murdered.
Muchas gracias, profesor. No sé si me escucha ahora. Perdón el inconveniente de antes,
Yes.
pero tal como decía, la tecnología me jugó una mala pasada. Hay varias preguntas que se refieren a un tema similar y voy a tratar de interpretarlo y pido disculpas si es que no logro interpretar todo lo que se está preguntando, pero muchas de las policías latinoamericanas, en particular Chile, Colombia, son policías militarizadas, que no es necesariamente el caso de policías como la de Reino Unido. Pensando en la lógica de reformas policiales, en el cambio que se quiera lograr desde esta lógica de protección de las personas, volviendo a Peel y a toda la corriente inglesa, ¿cómo uno puede trabajar con este tipo de policía o cómo puede propiciar el cambio? O bien, ¿qué sugiere usted respecto de que sean militares o no sean militares? ¿Cómo uno podría abordar este proceso? Porque puede ser complejo. Y me llegan distintas preguntas al respecto, por eso trato de englobarlas sobre un solo tema.
There are two key points here. One is that there's absolutely no evidence that if you were to convert the militarized police forces into civilianized forces with the same organizational systems, et cetera, that it would make any difference. A uniform, in some sense, is a uniform. But to the extent that a military force is disciplined and takes orders, it might be more useful to have a military force be ordered to do hotspots patrolling with the same seriousness as you're ordered to go to the front line in a battle. Not that you should have an orientation that you're going to do warfare in the hotspots, quite the contrary. But it's just in England and the US, the problem is getting the officers into the right places at the right time and having the discipline and the supervision to keep them in those places. You may find that if you want to reduce harm and also to reduce misconduct by police, that it could be an advantage to have the tighter control that goes with at least the principles of a military organization than what you have with the constabulary in the UK, in which nobody can order a police officer to make an arrest. It's hard to order a police officer to do much of anything because they all have an individual duty to the crown, to the queen, which gives them discretion. And that discretion is contrary to military doctrine. So I think that the discussions in the US over militarization, demilitarization, colonial policing, et cetera, are very distracting. They're just like different kinds of mud you can throw at the police, but they don't get us anywhere. They don't talk about what to do. What is the way we're going to change policing? And that's where I think we should concentrate our efforts.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Me voy a aprovechar solo con la última pregunta que nos llega desde la audiencia, que es un poco más a nivel general, que es cómo se integran los distintos sistemas de seguridad del Estado, más allá de la policía, para propiciar el trabajo de prevención, para evitar el escalamiento y que el foco sea la reducción del daño. Un poco volviendo a la pregunta de Daniel, es cómo cambiamos esta mentalidad de prevenir algo que no se ve finalmente, que no es sexy para las políticas públicas.
Well, COVID has been a wonderful public education about public health, and to approach the prevention of crime as a war on violence comparable to the war on COVID, which is a public health battle, I think is the best emotional resonance for having data sharing between the mental health systems, the hospitals where injuries are treated, but the violence isn't reported to the police, and other data sharing across these systems that manage harm. The essential partnership between public health, emergency medicine, mental health, and data sharing across all of those agencies with the police will identify people who are suicidal, and they're the ones who are most likely to kill their partners. So the prevention of domestic homicide starts with mental health partnership between the police and the potential murderers, who could be prevented with therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very effective at reducing repeat suicide attempts and would probably prevent domestic homicide by those same people. And that's just one example. But to build the resources and especially the information for the common goal of preventing violence must require multi-agency partnerships. But no more of this stuff about it's medical privacy, we're violating people's rights. If somebody's going to kill their spouse because we can say so statistically, I think we have to reassess how much privacy they have a right to, and how much risk we're willing to subject other people to getting killed because of protecting the privacy of that one patient.
Perfecto, clarísima respuesta. Muchísimas gracias, profesor, por tomarse el tiempo. Sabemos que he estado con una agenda muy apretada, llegando desde la India con un jet lag bastante intenso, así que le agradecemos nuevamente que se haya dado la gentileza de compartir con nosotros y con todo el público en general. Les quiero dar las gracias de parte de la Fundación Ciudadana al profesor, y le digo a la audiencia que nos vamos a tomar una pausa de hasta las 10:30 y ahí volvemos con el resto del programa. Así que nos vemos en un rato y de nuevo gracias, profesor.
Thank you all. Bye bye.